The autumn wind tugged at Mark Langston's jacket as he wandered aimlessly through the narrow streets of his quiet hometown. The golden leaves scattered across the cobblestone paths crunched softly under his worn sneakers. Mark shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, feeling the weight of his notebook tucked under his arm. The pages inside were blank, a testament to the creative drought that had plagued him for months. Once an aspiring author, Mark had moved back to this sleepy town in hopes of finding solace and inspiration, but instead, he'd found only routine and frustration. The charming streets, the quaint storefronts, the vintage charm, it all blurred together now, familiar to the point of monotony. His feet carried him forward without thought, past the coffee shop he frequented every morning, and the antique store he had once found intriguing. But as he turned onto a less familiar street, something stopped him in his tracks. Tucked between two shadowy brick buildings was a shop he had never seen before, though he had walked these streets countless times. The wooden sign above the door, painted in faded gold letters, read, "The Key of Time." The lettering shimmered faintly, catching the light in a way that didn't seem entirely natural. The display window was cluttered with oddities, antique clocks, dusty globes, and what appeared to be a collection of leather-bound books stacked haphazardly. Despite the shop's run-down appearance, there was something magnetic about it, as though the very air around it hummed with quiet intrigue. Mark hesitated, his fingers brushing the notebook under his arm. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he felt drawn to the place, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Pushing the door open, he was greeted by the soft chime of a bell, the sound echoing through the dimly lit interior. Inside, the air smelled of aged paper and cedarwood, the kind of scent that immediately brought to mind long-forgotten secrets. Rows of towering bookshelves lined the narrow space, their contents a mix of battered novels, weathered journals, and mysterious tomes with spines etched in foreign symbols. An old, brass chandelier hung crookedly from the ceiling, casting flickering light over the cluttered floor. Behind the counter stood a man who seemed as old as the shop itself, his thin frame wrapped in a tweed jacket, his eyes sharp and knowing beneath a pair of round spectacles. "Welcome," the man said, his voice carrying the faintest hint of amusement, as though he knew more about Mark than he let on. Mark offered a polite nod, suddenly self-conscious under the man's gaze. He wandered deeper into the shop, his eyes scanning the shelves aimlessly. And then he saw it. Nestled on a pedestal in the corner of the room, encased in a glass box, was a book unlike any he had ever seen. Its cover gleamed like polished metal, and faint patterns, like veins of light, pulsed across its surface. Mark stepped closer, unable to look away, his breath catching in his throat. There was something about the book, something that stirred a deep and unnameable longing in him, as though it held the answer to a question he didn't know he'd been asking. "What's this?" Mark asked, gesturing toward the book, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man behind the counter glanced up from whatever he'd been tinkering with, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Ah, that one," he said, his tone laced with an almost mischievous reverence. "It's been waiting for you." Mark frowned, unsure if the man was joking or not. "Waiting for me?" he echoed. The shopkeeper nodded, stepping closer. "Some things find their way to the right people at the right time," he said cryptically. "Go on, take a closer look." Mark hesitated only a moment. Before lifting the glass case, his fingers trembling slightly, The moment his hand brushed the book's surface, a faint ripple of energy shot up his arm. The shop seemed to hold its breath. Unseen lights flickered within the metallic veins of the cover, and for a fleeting moment, Mark thought he heard something, a whisper, faint and melodic, calling his name. Mark hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the strange metallic book. The pulsing light that danced across its surface seemed to respond to his presence, growing brighter the closer his fingers came. His heart thudded in his chest as he finally made contact with the smooth, cool surface. The moment his skin touched it, a shock of warmth shot through his hand, spreading up his arm like an electric current. It wasn't painful, but it was enough to make him flinch and pull back. Yet the book remained aglow, its intricate patterns of light now shifting and swirling in deliberate, almost hypnotic motions. Mark could hear the faintest hum, a sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the object itself, resonating not just in the room, but somewhere inside his own chest. He looked over his shoulder at the shopkeeper, who stood watching him with an amused but knowing expression. "Go on," the old man urged, his voice calm and deliberate. "It's meant for you." The words sent a chill down Mark's spine, but they also stirred his curiosity. Whatever this book was, it clearly wasn't ordinary. He opened the cover cautiously, the metallic surface cool against his fingertips. To his surprise, the pages weren't paper at all, but something that felt like thin sheets of polished glass, or perhaps some unknown material, smooth, slightly translucent, and covered in etched symbols that glimmered faintly. The symbols shifted and reformed as his eyes moved across them, their elegant curves transforming into shapes he could almost understand, but not quite. It was as though the book were trying to communicate with him, but hadn't yet found the right language. Suddenly, the symbols began to glow brighter, and before Mark could react, the entire page flared with a soft golden light. He squinted, shielding his eyes as a faint mist seemed to rise from the book, coalescing into a shape above it. The mist thickened, taking on form and substance until a figure stood before him. Tall, radiant, and undeniably otherworldly. A woman. Her skin shimmered in shades of silver and blue, her hair cascading like liquid light down her back. Her eyes, glowing with a faint violet hue, locked onto his with an intensity that made him forget how to breathe. "You've found me," the woman said, her voice melodic yet resonant, as if it carried the weight of 100 lifetimes. Mark stumbled back a step, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The shopkeeper, however, didn't seem surprised in the slightest. He leaned casually against the counter, his face a mask of quiet satisfaction. "I told you it was waiting for you," he said, almost smugly. Mark ignored him, his attention fixed on the woman. What are you?" he managed to stammer, his voice trembling. The woman stepped closer, the glow of her skin casting soft light across the dim room. "I am Kiara," she said, inclining her head in what seemed to be a gesture of respect. "I have waited lifetimes for this moment." She glanced at the book still clutched in Mark's hands, her expression softening. "That is my anchor, my lifeline to this world. And now, you are its keeper." Mark blinked, his mind reeling. None of this made sense, yet something about her presence felt right. He looked back at the shopkeeper, who was still watching them with quiet amusement. "What is this?" Mark demanded, his grip tightening on the book. The shopkeeper only smiled. "You'll see soon enough," he said cryptically. "But be warned, once you've opened that book, your life will never be the same." Mark sat cross-legged on the worn rug in his cramped living room, the mysterious book open in front of him on the coffee table. The faint glow of its metallic surface cast dancing shadows across the walls, the only source of light in the otherwise dimly lit room. Despite the surreal events at the bookshop earlier, his curiosity had overpowered his fear. He couldn't resist the pull of the book, the strange symbols on its pages teasing him with the promise of answers, or at least understanding. He ran his fingers lightly over the etched patterns again, marveling at their precision and the way they seemed to rearrange themselves beneath his touch. The symbols didn't just shimmer, they pulsated rhythmically, as though the book had a heartbeat of its own. His lamp flickered once, then twice, before the room was plunged into an uneasy quiet. Mark's breath caught. For a moment, he wondered if he should stop, close the book, and forget any of this had ever happened. But something deep within him, some instinct he couldn't name, urged him to press forward. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an almost electric charge. Mark squinted at the glowing symbols as they began to shift more rapidly now, the swirling patterns transforming into lines, then shapes, then finally words. English words. At first they were fragmented, disjointed phrases that didn't make sense. Awakened. Connection. Purpose. Mark read aloud, his voice shaky, as the words coalesced into clearer sentences. Suddenly, the entire page flared with light, and the words seemed to leap off the surface, hanging in the air before him in brilliant golden script. He leaned back instinctively as the light intensified, filling the room with an otherworldly radiance. "What the—" he began. But his words were cut short as the symbols began to coalesce, their golden glow folding in on itself and condensing into a single point of light. The air buzzed with an audible hum, and a faint breeze stirred, though there were no open windows. Then with a sound like a distant chime, the light burst outward, and she appeared. She was no longer an intangible vision of mist and light. This time, she was fully real, fully present. The woman who had emerged from the book in the shop now stood before him, her silver blue skin shimmering softly under the flickering light of the room. Her long hair, a cascade of what looked like liquid silver, flowed down her back, moving faintly as though caught in an invisible current. Her eyes, those deep, glowing violet orbs, locked onto Mark with an intensity that made him forget to breathe. "You've done it," she said softly, her voice carrying a melodic resonance that seemed to echo in the corners of his mind. Mark stumbled to his feet, his back hitting the edge of the couch as he stared at her in disbelief. "What is this? What are you doing here? How—" She tilted her head slightly, studying him as though he were the strange one. "You opened the book," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "You awakened the connection that binds us. I am Kiara, and you are my anchor." Her words stirred something in Mark, an inexplicable sense of recognition, as if he'd known her in some long-forgotten dream. Before he could form a coherent response, the room trembled slightly, a low rumble shaking the walls. Kiara's expression darkened as she glanced around. "They're coming," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, turning back to him, her voice sharpened with urgency. "We have to leave. Now." Mark barely had time to process Kiara's words before the room shook again, this time more violently. The picture frames on the walls rattled, a stack of books toppled from the shelf, and a strange, low-pitched hum seemed to fill the air, vibrating through his chest like a bass line in some unearthly melody. "What do you mean, they're coming?" "Who's coming?" Mark demanded, his voice rising as panic took hold. Kiara turned to him, her glowing violet eyes narrowing with urgency. "The Seekers," she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "They've tracked the activation of the book. They won't stop until they have me and the knowledge I carry." Her words were like a thunderclap in his mind, breaking through his confusion. "Knowledge? What knowledge?" Mark asked, but his question was drowned out as the hum grew louder, sharper, almost piercing. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of a shadow moving unnaturally fast across the street, and then another. "Mark," Kiara said, stepping closer to him. Her voice, calm yet commanding, cut through his spiraling thoughts. "If they catch us, it won't just be me they take. They'll erase everything, your memories, your life. The book binds us now, and they won't risk leaving you behind." Her words made his stomach churn, but before he could respond, the light outside the window dimmed unnaturally, as though something massive was blocking out the streetlights. A high-pitched whine filled the air, followed by the sharp crack of glass. Mark spun toward the sound just as the window above his desk shattered inward, scattering shards across the room. A small, spherical drone hovered outside, its dark surface gleaming like polished obsidian. A single red light pulsed in its center, scanning the room with mechanical precision. "Get down!" Kiara shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him to the floor, just as a beam of searing light shot from the drone, scorching a blackened line across the wall where his head had been moments earlier. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as Kiara crouched beside him, her hand gripping his wrist tightly. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice lower now, almost a whisper, but the urgency was no less intense. "The book has a defensive mechanism, but it's unstable. If they corner us, I can't guarantee our survival." Mark glanced at the glowing book on the coffee table, its metallic surface now pulsing erratically, as though reacting to the chaos. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Kiara looked at him, and for a brief moment, her expression softened. "Trust me," she said simply, before releasing his wrist and reaching out toward the book. Her fingers brushed the glowing cover, and immediately the light intensified, spilling out in waves that seemed to ripple through the air itself. The hum of the book rose to a crescendo, drowning out the sound of the drones outside. Mark felt a sudden pull, like an invisible hook dragging him forward, and before he could react, the light engulfed them both. The last thing he saw was Kiara's steady gaze locked onto his, her voice cutting through the roaring energy around them. "Hold on." When the light faded, the hum dissipating like a retreating tide, Mark found himself gasping for air. The cold, sterile floor beneath him was definitely not the soft rug of his living room. He looked around, his heart still racing, and saw Kiara standing beside him, her glowing hair moving faintly as though caught in a breeze that wasn't there. They were no longer in his house. The walls around them shimmered with a faint metallic sheen, inscribed with the same glowing symbols as the book. Where are we?" Mark managed to choke out. Kiara turned to him, a faint smile playing on her lips despite the tension still lingering in her eyes. "Someplace safe," she said, "for now." But the way her eyes darted to the shadows told him this safety was temporary at best. The book floated gently between them, its light dimming as though it had spent all its energy to bring them here. Whatever was happening, Mark knew there was no turning back now. The metallic walls of the chamber pulsed faintly with a soft blue light, casting shifting patterns onto Mark's pale face as he leaned heavily against the cold surface. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to steady himself. The events of the last few minutes, no, the last few hours, rushed through his mind in a chaotic torrent. He stared at the glowing book hovering in midair, its light flickering weakly now, like a dying ember. What the hell just happened? He stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. He looked up at Kiara, who was inspecting the symbols etched into the walls with an unsettling calm. Her silver blue skin shimmered faintly under the ambient light, her long, flowing hair moving as if caught in an invisible current. She turned to face him, her violet eyes glowing softly, their light cutting through the haze of his confusion. "I told you," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The book reacted to the threat. It brought us here to protect us." Mark pushed himself off the wall, his legs trembling slightly as he stepped closer to her. "Okay, but where is here exactly?" he asked, his tone laced with frustration and fear. "One moment we're in my living room, and the next, this." He gestured wildly to the chamber around them. Kiara tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "This is a sanctuary," she explained, running her fingers lightly over the glowing symbols on the wall. "One of many scattered across your world. Remnants of an ancient alliance between my people and humans. They're hidden, dormant, until the right energy signature activates them. The book recognized the danger and brought us to the nearest one." Mark blinked at her, his brow furrowing as he struggled to process her words. "Wait, what alliance? Humans? You're saying this has all happened before?" Kiara sighed, her glowing eyes softening slightly. "It's a long story," she said. "But yes, our species share a deeper connection than you know. That connection is why the book chose you." Her words hung heavily in the air, stirring an uneasy mixture of curiosity and disbelief in Mark's chest. He rubbed his temples, trying to stave off the creeping headache that had been building since she appeared in his life. "Okay, fine," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Let's assume I believe you. Why me? I'm nobody, just some guy trying to write a book. I don't have any special energy, or whatever it is you're talking about." Kiara stepped closer, her glowing form casting soft light across his face. "You underestimate yourself, Mark," she said, her tone almost gentle now. "The book doesn't just choose randomly. It seeks out those with the right resonance, those who carry a spark of something rare. Compassion, curiosity, strength. You may not see it yet, but it's there." Mark swallowed hard, unsure whether her words comforted him or terrified him. "And what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kiara's expression grew serious again, her gaze flicking to the dim light of the book. "Now, we prepare," she said. "The seekers won't stop. They'll find this sanctuary eventually, and when they do, we'll need to be ready." The weight of her statement settled over Mark like a lead blanket. He felt the enormity of the situation pressing down on him, the realization that his ordinary, uneventful life had been upended in the span of a single day. "Ready for what?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Kiara looked at him, her eyes glowing with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "For war, if it comes to that," she said simply. "But first, for survival. The sanctuary has tools, knowledge, things that will help us understand the book and the connection it forged between us. If we can unlock its secrets, we might stand a chance. Mark exhaled shakily, glancing at the book as it pulsed faintly in the air. The thought of war, of survival, felt alien to him, as though it belonged in one of the stories he'd been trying and failing to write. Yet, as Kiara's steady gaze met his, a flicker of resolve sparked somewhere deep within him. He didn't understand the full scope of what was happening, but for reasons he couldn't explain, he knew one thing. He wasn't going to walk away. Mark sat cross-legged on the cold metallic floor of the sanctuary, staring at the glowing book that now hovered a few inches above the surface. Its light was dimmer than before, but every so often it pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of some living thing. He had always thought of books as static objects, pages filled with ink, resting quietly on shelves. But this defied every rule of logic and reality he had ever known. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of the book's cover, and felt the now familiar warmth ripple through his hand. It was subtle but undeniable, a quiet reminder that his life had veered off into territory he couldn't begin to understand. Across the room, Kiara was pacing in slow, deliberate circles, her silver-blue skin reflecting the ambient glow of the chamber. Her expression was calm, but Mark could see the tension in her every movement. "You're not telling me everything," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice echoed faintly in the chamber, bouncing off the etched walls. "This book, these seekers, this connection between us, there's more to it, isn't there?" Kiara stopped mid-step and turned to face him, her violet eyes catching the light and seeming to hold galaxies within them. "You're perceptive," she said with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, there's more." She crossed the room and crouched down in front of him, her movements graceful, almost otherworldly. "The book isn't just a tool or a weapon," she explained, her voice quiet but steady. "It's a key, a repository of knowledge that was meant to bridge the gap between my people and yours. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors believed in unity, in collaboration. But over time, that vision fractured. My people ascended to what you might call a higher state of existence, leaving their physical forms behind. Those of us who chose to remain behind were tasked with protecting the artifacts that could restore that unity." She gestured toward the book, her silver-blue fingers hovering just above its surface. "This book is one of the last of those artifacts, and now it's bound to you." Mark blinked, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't even begin to articulate. "Bound to me?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "What does that even mean? I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose this." Kiara's gaze softened, and for a moment, her expression was almost apologetic. "I know," she said quietly, "but the book doesn't choose lightly. It saw something in you. Something I see too. A spark of courage, of curiosity. You may not feel ready, but you are." She leaned back slightly, giving him space to process her words. Mark ran a hand through his hair, the weight of her explanation settling heavily on his shoulders. Before he could respond, a faint vibration hummed through the floor, barely perceptible at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. Kiara's head snapped up, her glowing eyes narrowing. "They've found us," she said, her voice suddenly sharp with urgency. Mark scrambled to his feet, his pulse spiking as the vibration turned into a low rumble. The walls of the sanctuary, once still and serene, began to shimmer erratically, the glowing symbols flashing brighter and dimmer in rapid succession. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. Kiara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved to one of the walls, her hand tracing the symbols with practiced precision. The patterns shifted under her touch, rearranging themselves into new shapes. "The sanctuary was designed to protect us," she said, her tone focused, almost clinical. "But its defenses are old, fragile. If the Seekers breach the outer perimeter, it won't hold for long." Mark's chest tightened as he watched her work, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "There has to be something we can do," he said, his voice rising. Kiara turned to him, her expression fierce. "There is," she said. "We fight. We use the book. But if we fail—" She trailed off, her eyes darkening. Mark nodded, a flicker of determination rising within him despite his fear. "Then we don't fail," he said. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he believed it. The sanctuary trembled as if the very air had turned volatile, the glowing symbols on the walls flickering like dying embers. Mark felt the weight of something immense pressing down on him, not physically, but as if an unseen force was shifting the fabric of reality around them. His pulse hammered in his ears as he turned to Kiara, who was already moving with purpose, her silver blue skin reflecting the pulsating light of the ancient chamber. She pressed her hands against the wall, and the symbols rearranged themselves beneath her touch, glowing in response to her presence. Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady his thoughts. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice tight. "This place isn't safe anymore." Kiara didn't look up, but he saw the faintest nod of agreement. "No, it's not," she murmured, "but there's still time." Mark watched as the symbols on the wall shifted again, forming patterns he didn't recognize. Intricate spirals and interlocking lines that seemed to pulse with an intelligence of their own. Then, as if responding to an unspoken command, the sanctuary ceiling split open in a perfect seam, revealing a vast, star-streaked sky above them. A surge of wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of something ancient, something forgotten. Mark took an instinctive step back, his eyes widening as he saw what lay beyond. Floating above them was not just open air, but a vast, circular structure, an enormous gateway suspended in the void, its surface shimmering like liquid glass. Energy crackled along its edges, and within its swirling core, faint images flickered, glimpses of alien landscapes, cities built on floating islands, endless seas reflecting twin suns. "The portal," Kiara said, her voice filled with reverence. "It still exists." Mark tore his gaze away from the mesmerizing sight and turned to Kiara. "You knew this was here?" he asked, his breath uneven. Kiara exhaled softly, as if the weight of centuries pressed against her chest. "I hoped," she admitted. "This sanctuary is one of the last places tied to my people. If the portal still functions, it means the connection between my world and yours isn't broken." She finally met his gaze, and in her glowing violet eyes, he saw something he hadn't before. Hope, tempered by fear. "The book didn't just bring us here for safety," she continued. "It brought us here because this is where we make our choice. If we activate the portal, we can restore the link between our worlds." Mark felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He could hear the urgency in her voice, but also something else, something unspoken. "But," he prompted. Kiara hesitated. "But if we open it, the Seekers will know. They'll come with everything they have to stop us." She took a step closer, her expression unreadable. "And if they get through first, They won't just take the book. They'll take control of the portal itself. The weight of her words settled heavily in the air between them. Mark glanced back at the glowing gateway, then at Kiara. His life had changed the moment he had touched that book, but now, for the first time, he truly understood. This wasn't just about him anymore. The portal loomed above them, a massive swirling vortex of liquid light suspended in the air. Its shimmering surface pulsed with energy, casting ghostly reflections onto the metallic walls of the sanctuary. Mark felt its pull, not just physically, but somewhere deeper, like a whisper at the edge of his thoughts. He didn't know whether it was calling to him or warning him. Kiara stood beside him, her glowing violet eyes locked onto the shifting images flickering across the portal's surface. Glimpses of cities built into mountains, of towering crystalline spires, of an ocean the color of molten silver. "That's your world," Mark murmured, his voice barely above a breath. Kiara nodded slowly, but there was hesitation in her posture, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Or what's left of it," she corrected. "If the connection to the portal was severed for this long, I don't know what we'll find on the other side." Mark turned to her, frowning. "I thought you said this was the only way to restore it," he asked. "To stop the Seekers from taking control?" Kiara exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering herself. "It is," she admitted. "But opening the portal isn't just about reconnecting worlds. It's about choice." She met his gaze then, and there was something unreadable in her expression. Something almost vulnerable. "Once it's open, we may not be able to close it again. And once we step through, we may not be able to come back." The words settled over Mark like a stone in his chest. He swallowed hard, his mind racing with the implications. Everything about his life, his quiet, uneventful existence, his unfinished manuscript, the normalcy he had clung to, was slipping further and further away. If he chose to go with her, there was no telling what lay beyond that shimmering doorway. But if he stayed, if he refused, the Seekers would come. And this time, there would be no sanctuary left to run to. The ground trembled beneath them, a deep, reverberating pulse that sent dust cascading from the sanctuary walls. Kiara's head snapped toward the far end of the chamber, where the glowing symbols along the surface flickered erratically. "They're here," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. Mark's breath caught as the first crack split the wall, thin at first, then widening as a surge of energy ruptured through the barrier. Through the jagged opening, he saw shadows moving. Figures in sleek black armor, their weapons humming with an eerie, unnatural light. The Seekers had arrived. Kiara turned back to him, and for the first time, her confidence wavered. "We have to decide now," she said. "If we activate the portal, we go through together. If not—" She trailed off, but Mark didn't need her to finish. If not, the Seekers would take everything. He clenched his fists, inhaled sharply, and looked at the glowing book still hovering between them. The choice had already been made. "Then let's do it," he said, stepping forward. Kiara's lips parted slightly in surprise, but a moment later, determination flooded her features. Without another word, she placed her hands on the portal's frame, and as the light intensified, the sanctuary exploded into chaos. The first explosion hit like a thunderclap, shaking the sanctuary's foundations with enough force to send Mark stumbling forward. Dust and fragments of stone rained down from the ceiling as the walls trembled under the impact. The once steady glow of the portal flickered, its swirling energy destabilizing with each violent tremor. Mark barely had time to regain his footing before the second blast tore through the chamber's far wall, sending shockwaves of heat and pressure across the room. The rupture widened, revealing the unmistakable silhouettes of the Seekers as they stepped through the haze of dust and debris. Their armor gleamed with an unnatural black sheen, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Their faces were obscured behind sleek, featureless helmets, and in their hands they carried weapons that pulsed with eerie blue energy. Mark's breath hitched. There were more of them than he had expected. Kiara reacted instantly, her body shifting into a defensive stance as tendrils of light flared to life along her arms. The markings on her silver-blue skin pulsed in synchrony with the book, which was now hovering erratically between them, its glow growing wilder by the second. "They're trying to disrupt the portal," she called out, her voice sharp with urgency. Mark could barely hear her over the rising hum of the Seekers' weapons charging. "If they collapse it before we go through, we're trapped." Mark's heart pounded. Trapped. The word clawed at the edges of his mind, feeding the raw panic already building in his chest. He forced himself to focus. "Then how do we stop them?" he asked, shifting closer to her. Kiara's glowing violet eyes flicked to his, assessing him in an instant. "We fight." And before he could react, she moved. The air crackled as Kiara launched forward with impossible speed, her form a blur of light and motion. The first Seeker barely had time to raise his weapon before Kiara's energy-clad fist slammed into his chest, sending him skidding backward into the darkness. The impact sent ripples through the chamber, distorting the air around them. Mark barely had time to process the sheer power she wielded before the rest of the Seekers reacted, their weapons firing in unison. Bright streaks of blue energy tore through the air, striking the ground where Kiara had been standing only a second before. She twisted midair, her body moving with a grace that defied physics, avoiding the blasts with inhuman precision. But she was only one against many, and they were adapting. Mark turned to the portal. It was still unstable, its energy warping unpredictably. If they didn't act now, they'd lose their chance. He clenched his fists. No more running, no more hesitating. He wasn't just some bystander in this anymore. He had a role to play. Bracing himself, he lunged toward the book, reaching for the pulsing core of energy at its center. The moment his fingers touched its surface, a jolt of power surged through him, igniting his senses in a way he had never experienced before. His mind flooded with knowledge, fragments of lost histories, forgotten battles, whispers of ancient civilizations that had once stood where he now did. The book recognized him, accepted him, and with that realization came control. He felt it bending to his will, waiting for his command. As the Seekers closed in, Mark exhaled, his fear dissolving into something else entirely. Purpose. He looked up, eyes now reflecting the same pulsing energy as the book, and met Kiara's gaze. "Let's finish this," he said. And this time, he meant it. The chamber was collapsing around them. The portal pulsed erratically, its energy arcs lashing out like wild lightning, sending waves of heat and force through the air. The Seekers were closing in, their sleek black armor barely visible through the swirling storm of dust and raw power. Mark could feel the book's energy coursing through him, an overwhelming presence surging in his veins, heightening his senses to an almost unbearable degree. The knowledge it had given him was still settling in his mind, pieces shifting and aligning like a puzzle completing itself in real time. He could see patterns now, flaws in the Seekers' attack formation, gaps in their movements, weaknesses in their armor. It was as if the book wasn't just feeding him information, but rewriting how he perceived reality itself. But the knowledge came at a cost. The energy required to wield it was draining him rapidly, burning through him like fire in his bloodstream. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. Kiara fought like a living tempest, her body weaving through the onslaught of energy blasts with impossible speed. The glow of her skin intensified with every strike she landed, sending shock waves rippling through the air as her fists connected with the Seeker's armor. But even she was slowing down. Mark could see it. The slight hesitation in her movements, the fraction of a second delay between attacks. She was pushing herself past her limits, and they both knew it. "Mark," she called out, barely dodging another blast. Her eyes flicked toward the portal, then back at him. "It's now or never. We either go through, or we lose everything." Mark turned to the portal, its swirling mass of energy now unstable, flickering between dimensions like a radio signal struggling to hold frequency. He could feel its pull deep in his core, urging him forward, but something was wrong. The energy was shifting, twisting. The Seekers had done something. He looked back at Kiara, realization striking him like a thunderclap. "They're trying to hijack it," he said, his voice hoarse. "They don't just want to stop us. They want to control the portal themselves." Kiara's expression hardened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only made the situation more dire. If the Seekers managed to take control of the portal, they wouldn't just block their escape. They would turn it into a weapon, a conduit for their invasion. "Then we stop them," she said, her voice low and steady. "Together." Mark didn't hesitate. He reached for the book again, this time fully embracing its energy. The moment his hand met its surface, a surge of light exploded outward, engulfing both him and Kiara in a brilliant glow. He could feel her energy intertwining with his, their connection strengthening, amplifying. The sanctuary trembled as a final blast rocked the chamber, sending shock waves through the floor. The Seekers advanced for one last assault, but it was too late. Mark and Kiara turned in unison, their combined power colliding with the portal's core, sealing its control under their will. The Seekers barely had time to react before the portal roared to life, its energy folding inward, consuming itself. One by one, the Seekers were pulled into the collapsing vortex, their forms vanishing into the void. And then, with a final pulse of blinding light, everything went still. Silence followed. The dust settled. The portal, once chaotic and wild, now stood before them, stable, controlled, waiting. Kiara exhaled, her shoulders sagging, but her eyes still burned with determination. "We did it," she whispered. Mark swallowed hard, the weight of what they had just accomplished settling over him. The book had chosen them for a reason, and now there was only one thing left to do. He looked at Kiara, his heartbeat steady now, no longer frantic with fear. "Let's go," he said. Side by side, they stepped toward the gateway, and as the light enveloped them, the last remnants of the old world faded away. The portal's energy wrapped around them like a tidal wave, pulling Mark and Kiara through a corridor of shifting light and shadows. The sensation was unlike anything Mark had ever experienced. His body felt weightless, yet every nerve burned with the overwhelming rush of energy surging through him. Colors bled into one another in streaks of silver, gold, and deep violet. And somewhere in the distance, he swore he could hear whispers, echoes of forgotten voices, of memories that weren't his. Then, with a forceful jolt, gravity reasserted itself, and the world snapped into focus. Mark stumbled forward, barely catching himself as his boots hit solid ground. The air was heavy, charged with something unfamiliar, something ancient. Around them, towering monolithic structures stretched into the sky, their surfaces etched with the same glowing symbols that had once covered the book. The architecture was unlike anything he had seen before. Elegant, sweeping curves blended seamlessly with sharp geometric patterns, as if designed by forces beyond human understanding. But the city was eerily silent. Kiara was already on her feet, her glowing eyes scanning the environment with a mix of awe and trepidation. "This is it," she murmured. "My home." Her voice carried a weight Mark hadn't heard before. Not just relief, but something deeper. Grief. She took a step forward, her fingers brushing against one of the massive structures as if to confirm it was real. The symbols along its surface pulsed weakly in response to her touch, like a slumbering giant stirring at her presence. Mark followed her gaze, his own sense of wonder battling against the unease creeping into his chest. "It's empty," he said quietly, his breath visible in the cool air. "Where is everyone?" Kiara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the sky, a vast expanse of deep indigo, where twin moons loomed overhead like silent sentinels. "They were supposed to wait," she said finally, her voice almost too soft to hear. "If the portal remained intact, if the connection was ever reestablished, they were supposed to return." She exhaled sharply, her composure faltering for the first time. "But there's no one here." Mark felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had no idea what he expected to find on the other side of the portal. An advanced alien civilization waiting with open arms? A war-torn battlefield? But this was worse. A world preserved in time, yet devoid of life. His hand tightened into a fist as he turned to Kiara. "We'll find them," he said firmly. "If there's any chance they're still out there, we'll figure it out." Kiara's glowing eyes met his, searching for something in his expression. Whatever she found, there seemed to steady her, because after a moment, she nodded. "We have to be careful," she warned. "The Seekers wouldn't have let us come through if they didn't have a plan. If they followed us—" She stopped abruptly, her posture shifting. Mark didn't need to ask what was wrong. He felt it too, a change in the air, a presence. And then, from the shadows of the towering structures, something moved. They weren't alone. The silence shattered. From the shadows of the towering structures, figures emerged, tall, deliberate, and unmistakably hostile. Their black armor gleamed under the pale light of the twin moons, their faceless helmets concealing whatever semblance of humanity or sentience lay beneath. The Seekers had followed them. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he instinctively took a step back, his mind racing. How? The portal had collapsed behind them. He had seen it with his own eyes. But then he realized the truth, and a cold dread spread through him. They hadn't followed. They had been waiting. This wasn't just Kiara's homecoming. It was a trap. Kiara was already moving, her body shifting into a defensive stance, her glowing markings pulsing in rapid succession. The book hovered between them, its energy fluctuating wildly, reacting to the presence of danger. "We can't let them take the city," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "If they gain control of the structures here, They'll have access to knowledge that was never meant to be theirs. Mark clenched his fists, the residual energy from the book still pulsing through his veins. He wasn't the same person he had been before all of this. Before the book, before Kiara, before the sanctuary. Fear was still there, but it no longer ruled him. He turned to Kiara, nodding once. Then we make our stand. The Seekers moved in unison, weapons charging with an eerie, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the ground beneath them. The first shot came fast, a bolt of searing blue energy that tore through the air, aimed directly at Kiara. But she was faster. With a flick of her wrist, a barrier of pure light erupted between them, deflecting the blast and sending it ricocheting off a nearby wall. Mark didn't hesitate. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He reached out, and the book responded. Energy surged through him, raw and untamed. But this time, he didn't fight it. He let it guide him. With a sweeping motion, he directed the force outward, sending a shock wave rippling through the air. The nearest seeker was lifted off the ground and hurled backward, crashing into the side of a crumbling structure. Kiara took advantage of the opening, launching herself forward with impossible speed. Her form blurred as she weaved through the incoming fire, striking with precision and force that sent their attackers reeling. But for every seeker that fell, another took its place. Mark gritted his teeth, the strain of wielding the book's power beginning to take its toll. His vision blurred at the edges, and he could feel the energy burning through him faster than his body could keep up. "Mark!" Kiara's voice cut through the chaos, urgent and commanding. He turned just in time to see the lead seeker raising a device, something different, something powerful. Before he could react, a pulse of dark energy erupted from it, slamming into Kiara with crushing force. She cried out, her body collapsing to the ground as the light around her flickered dangerously. Rage ignited in Mark's chest, white hot and all-consuming. He didn't think, he just moved. The book's energy flared brighter than ever before, responding to his fury. With a final push, he unleashed everything he had left. A column of raw golden light erupted from the book, expanding outward in a wave of destruction. The Seekers were caught in its wake, their forms disintegrating as the force consumed them. The light burned through the structures, but instead of destroying them, it reignited something. Symbols flared back to life. The city itself seemed to awaken. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the battle was over. Mark stumbled forward, barely catching himself as exhaustion overtook him. The Seekers were gone. The city was still standing. And Kiara was alive. She stirred, her glowing eyes opening slowly as she looked up at him. "You did it," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. Mark let out a shaky breath and offered her his hand. "No," he corrected, his lips curving into a small, exhausted smile. "We did." The city around them pulsed with new life, and for the first time since they had arrived, the silence felt different, not empty, not abandoned, but waiting. The city no longer felt lifeless. The glowing symbols embedded in the towering structures pulsed steadily, as if awakening from a long slumber. Soft currents of energy ran through the streets, illuminating pathways that had been dark for centuries. The air itself carried a charge, subtle, humming, alive. Mark could feel it beneath his skin, a gentle thrumming that resonated with the lingering energy of the book. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a presence, aware of their arrival, responding to their existence. He exhaled slowly, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no immediate danger, no looming threat. The battle was over. They had won. He turned to Kiara, who stood beside him, her silver-blue skin illuminated by the city's renewed light. She was staring out over the horizon, where the twin moons cast long, ethereal shadows over the ancient architecture. But her expression was distant, unreadable. Mark stepped closer, watching her carefully. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, absent of urgency. Kiara didn't respond right away. Instead, she ran a hand over one of the massive stone pillars beside her, tracing the ancient inscriptions with delicate fingers. The symbols glowed faintly beneath her touch, reacting to her presence like an old friend waking from a deep sleep. "I always imagined this moment," she murmured finally, her voice carrying an almost fragile quality. "Coming home, restoring what was lost. But now that I'm here, I don't know if this place is home anymore." Mark frowned slightly, letting her words settle between them. He understood, in a way. The city was magnificent, a testament to a civilization that had once thrived, but it was also empty. Whatever had happened to Kiara's people had left scars not just on the land, but in the silence itself. "Home isn't just a place," Mark said after a moment. "It's the people in it, the connections you make." He hesitated, then met her gaze. "And I don't think your story is over yet." Kiara studied him, her glowing violet eyes searching his for something unspoken. Then after a long pause, she smiled. Not the practiced diplomatic smile he'd seen before, but something real, something warm. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She turned fully toward him now, the weight of her past still there, but tempered by something new. Resolve, hope. The book led us here, but it's not just about the past. It's about what comes next. Mark nodded, his own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The book still pulsed between them, its glow softer now, more stable. It had chosen them for a reason, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't finished guiding them yet. Kiara reached for his hand, her fingers cool against his, but steady. "We find out what happened," she said. "We search for the others. If there's still a future for my people, we build it." Mark squeezed her hand lightly, his own silent promise forming between them. Whatever came next, they wouldn't face it alone. The city stretched before them, no longer a hollow monument to the past, but a place brimming with potential. The structures, once dormant, hummed with renewed energy, responding to Kiara's presence like a long-lost heartbeat finding its rhythm again. The air carried a quiet, electric hum, a sign that whatever power had sustained this world had not faded completely. It had simply been waiting. Mark stood beside her at the edge of a towering platform, overlooking the vast expanse of alien architecture. It still felt surreal, standing on a world that shouldn't exist, surrounded by structures built by hands that had vanished long before his time. But the weight of impossibility no longer crushed him. He had stepped through the portal, uncertain of what they would find, and now, as the city pulsed beneath his feet, he realized something. This was only the beginning. Kiara held the book in her hands, its glow soft but steady, as if it, too, had settled into a quiet certainty. "It's changed," she murmured, turning it over slowly. Mark glanced at it, noticing for the first time that the shifting symbols on its cover had taken on a new pattern, one he hadn't seen before. "What does it mean?" he asked. Kiara studied it for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't know yet," she admitted. The book was never just a key. It adapts, evolves. It gave us the portal when we needed it. But now, it's pointing to something else. She ran her fingers lightly over the surface, and as she did, the symbols shifted again, forming a series of interconnected lines. A map, a destination. Mark felt something stir in his chest. Not fear, not exhaustion, but excitement. The unknown no longer felt like an abyss waiting to swallow him whole. It felt like a call to something greater. Kiara looked at him then, her glowing violet eyes reflecting the twin moons above. "We don't have to do this," she said softly. "The portal is stable now. We could go back, try to live normal lives." Mark let out a quiet breath, glancing back at the shimmering gateway, still pulsing in the distance. The idea of returning to Earth, to the predictable world he had left behind, should have been comforting. But instead, it felt small, incomplete. He turned back to Kiara, a slow smile forming on his lips. "Normal?" he echoed. "I think we passed that exit a long time ago." Kiara laughed, a sound full of something lighter than before. "Relief. Trust." She turned the book toward him, letting him place his hand beside hers on its surface. The symbol shifted again, responding to them both, solidifying the path ahead. Whatever came next, whether it was answers, survivors, or something else entirely, they would face it together. The city of her ancestors had been waiting for centuries, but their future wouldn't be spent lingering in its ruins. It was time to move forward. Together, they stepped toward the unknown.